B'ez Hashem Yisbarach, we begin Perek Chamisha, the fifth Perek in the Rambam Hilchos Gerushin, the laws of divorce, and Sefer Noshim, which the Rambam continues explaining the pasuk, which is the source of the halacha of get, where in the previous Perek he spoke about b'chas of law, Sefer creases regarding the writing, as the pasuk continues regarding the giving of the get. And halacha Aleph, the Rambam opens up with qualifying this halacha. B'zeh number Torah says, and this is what it says in the Torah, b'nasan b'yada, that he puts it in her hand. It says in Devarim Chavdal, the pasuk that we've been explaining. Says the Rambam, "Ein in hakasav el shegia get li law." What the pasuk means to say is that just that the get has to reach her, but it's not specifically in her hand. As the Rambam says, "V'echad yada," whether it be her hand, a cheka, or her bosom is one interpretation, or according to Taisus, it actually means the part of the garment that's dragging on the ground and it's thrown on that. Echatzeira, or her courtier, a shalucha, or her agent. She'asasa yada ki yada, that his hand is like her hand. It's all the same thing as the Gemara tells in Gittin. Had it said of the yada yitneno, in her hand it should be given, it would have sounded like specifically in her hand. And now that it says the word v'nasan first, sounds like whatever the giving is, and it doesn't have to be specifically her hand. So what does yada then tell us? It's qualifying, which means her domain, as we find the pasuk v'yikach kol artsa b'yadai. It means a person's domain. So why do you say yada? To teach us that just like her hand is right next to her and is protected, so too the area that it's being given into has to be protected with her consciousness, her thought, just like she protects her hand, as Rambam will explain later in Halacha Yud Zayin. But it's not specifically in her hand. And says Rambam, Echad Chatzera Kanuyala, whether it be a courtyard that she was acquired to her, she owns it, a Chatzera Muskeris, or a courtyard that she rents, a Shula, or that was lent to her. Hakol Rishusi, it's all considered her domain. Umishigia get Rishus in this Garsha, and the moment it reaches her domain, she's divorced, it's not specifically in her hand. Now, Halacha Beis, the Rambam continues regarding throwing the get to the wife's domain. Halacha Beis. Hazari get le'ishto l'techatzer. So if someone throws a get to his wife into her courtyard, which we just said before that works, so it depends. If she was standing over there on the side of a courtyard, then discussion, then she's divorced. If not, then she's not divorced until she stands on the side of a courtyard, because, like we said, the courtyard has to be like her hand. Just like her hand, not only that it's protected by her, it's what's called mishtameres by her, but it's also near her, so to her courtyard has to be near her. And even though it has the other quality, that the courtyard is something that it's going to be protected inside of it, let's say it's locked, even so, so it's not going to work because she's not near it, but what the Rambam is addressing is that maybe you would think it's going to work mitam shlichus because of agency, and I would say no, because divorce is something negative for her. You can't do something negative to a personal liability unless it's in front of the person. In other words, so don't think to say that it's going to work as shlichus. From the moment you put it in their courtyard, it's like giving it to her agent, which her agent is like her. So Rambam explains that no, since it's liability, you cannot say you're appointing a shlich without her acquiescence, without her agreement, when she's not there, and therefore it's not going to work, again, for both reasons. One is she's not there, so it's not going to work mitam yad, which is v'nasl b'yada, and neither is it going to work as shlichus because it's in chavan l'adam ela b'fanam. Halacha gimel. Let's say she was standing on the top of her roof, and his property is right neighboring her house, is his courtyard, and he's on the bottom there in his courtyard. And he's throwing it upwards towards her, where she is on her roof. So once it reaches to the airspace of the walls of the makkah, which is that there's a wall has to surround the roof, which that's a protected area from the wind and the elements. So once it gets into the airspace of her walls on her roof, or at least it reaches within 3 tvachim from the roof, which that's always known as lavid, which is like it's connected to the ground, which is samach legag, near the roof itself, even if there is no makkah, even though there's no walls over there, but it's within 3 tvachim, either one of those, Niskasha, she's going to be divorced. Now, because then it's already like it's in there, but u'b'vat. However, what is a requisite is that it has to ultimately land on the roof literally itself, and then retroactively we're going to say that she's divorced, meaning from the moment that it was within the mechitzas or that it was within 3 tvachim, that even if the husband died before it actually landed, or if someone else was mekadosh her in that in-between time from the reach the airspace and until it landed, then she's divorced from the first one and she's engaged to the second one. But it has to ultimately land. Because as the Rambam says, but let's say it gets erased. Or gets burnt before it actually reaches her. So even though it got erased, let's say it was raining, after it reached the airspace of the walls. Or after that it was already within 3 tvachim from the roof. For example, let's say the wind blew, and it lifted up, and it got dissolved, or it got burned. So here, although it was already b'makam ha'mishtamer, but since it wasn't going to be landing, it's not a get. But in discussion, should not be divorced. This is what's known as avish she'in seifel l'nuach. This airspace, which is going against gravity, is not necessarily going to land. So it's not like landed until it actually lands. So although technically it does work from the moment it's within 3 tvachim, or from when it's in the airspace of the walls, but it has to ultimately land. And if it doesn't, then it's like it never did. Now, however, says the Ram halacha dalet. Let's say hayagag shaloi. Let's say it's the other way around. The roof was his, behumal alaba, and he's on top of his roof. And she's down in her courtyard below. And he's throwing her get. Once the get is removed from the walls of the roof, which is his airspace, and it's within the walls of her area of the courtyard below, then this garsha, then she's already automatically divorced, even if it doesn't ultimately reach the ground and it doesn't land, because whenever you're throwing it with gravity, which is from top down, so that's what's called hoylech lenuach. So then it's considered like as if it landed even before it or it never lands, and therefore, even if it doesn't make it, she's going to be divorced. The halacha hey, let's say, and this is all on the same thing regarding if it's avish seifel lenuach or not, if he's throwing the get to her domain, l'toicha eish, v'nisref, into the fire, and it gets burnt, meaning that initially the trajectory was going to be burnt, and it was not going to land anything because he was throwing it towards, let's say, where she has her fire pit. And that's called avashin seifel lenuach. Well, let's say he's throwing it into her property, and it's right over where she has a pool, and it falls into the water, and it gets dissolved. It never gets lost. So in a get, it's not going to be a get, because here from in its inception, since the fire or the pool or whatever it is was here before the get was thrown, that's considered avishin seifel lenuach, and never the airspace is not considered like it landed, and it actually never made it because it gets ruined before it's in her domain. Now, aval megil or shusa benach, but if let's say it reaches her domain and it lands where it doesn't really mean, and some girsos don't even have the word benach, it means once it gets into airspace, it's like it landed, even if it doesn't literally land, because here only the achakach bo'esh osrafasu. Here the fire only came subsequently. It was going to land on a regular place, and then the fire comes along and burns it. Again, here hari is a get. Here it's going to be a get because it was avish seifel lenuach. So even if it didn't ultimately make it, the airspace itself, which was supposed to land, is like it landed, and therefore it's going to be as a get. Halacha vav. Zraka gabekana. Let's say he throws it again into her property, and it lands on top of a reed, a remach, or a spear, hanautzim b'shusa, which is stuck into her property, but the top of the spear is higher than the walls of her courtyard. So in the get, it's not a get. Until it lands in a place where it's going to be protected, and here it's not protected because the wind could blow it away, and it could go out of the wall space of the courtyard. Let's say let's say 2 courtyards, one within the other one, and the inner one is hers, and the outer courtyard is his. Moreover, the walls of his property, the outer walls, are higher than the inner ones. So once he throws it into the airspace of the outer walls, meaning to say, we're talking about where his walls surround the inner ones, and the outer walls are higher than the inner walls, and he's throwing it towards the inner chutzner, so although it doesn't reach, let's say in height, to the airspace of the inner courtyard of those walls, but once it's opposite that area, and it's within the airspace of the outer walls, in a way that the wind, let's say, can't blow it away anymore, so in this kosher, then she's already divorced. Shapanim is because the inner courtyard, because is protected with the walls of the outer courtyard, which is his, so therefore, once it's over her airspace, even though it's not in the walls itself, she's going to already be divorced, which is not the case by boxes. As the Rambam continues, what is that case? You have 2 boxes, one within the other. Same as the courtyards, but here it's regarding boxes. The inner box is hers, and the outer box is his, and they're both in his property. The zark lagita b'teicha, then he throws her get into her box. So here, even though it's in the airspace of the inner box, not divorced, until it lands. Al-tzara kupa panim is on the inner part of the box. And the reason that is because the walls of vessels, let's say boxes, are not made to be protected in its airspace, because a box is meant only to put inside on the bottom. And that's actually different between the case of the previous halacha of the two courtyards to the halacha here of the two boxes. Now, but even so, says the Rambam, when do we say this? Only if this box is laying on its side and doesn't have a bottom. So because of that, the husband's not so particular regarding the place that is taken up in his property, because it's not even fit to use in a regular utility. That's what we say, if it lands on, it doesn't have a bottom, on its side, which is now on its side, so that's like the bottom, that's when it's going to work. But if let's say the box has a bottom, then even lands on the bottom of the box, it literally lands inside of it, in the McGresh should not going to be divorced, because that's fit to have regular utility, and the husband particularly doesn't want anyone using his space in his house. And the reason is because the vessels, the utensils of the woman in the husband's domain, will not acquire for a get, unless he's not particular about his place. But until we know otherwise, it's not going to work to be mekabel her get. Now, Allah Ram continues regarding throwing the get to her in the domain of the husband, as we said in the previous halacha. Zark Gita, if he throws her get, and she's in his house, or in his courtyard, so in the McGresh, not divorced, until the get reaches her hand, or to her own private utensils, as we said in the previous halacha, has to be those which the husband is not particular about. Kugoin, for example, tzleiches, her bottle, like fifa, katana, or a small basket, or kisman, things like that, where if a husband's letting his wife into his property, it's with that intention that her small little items, her stuff that she's got, that is things that he's not particular about, and she could have those things, and if it lands in there, she's going to be divorced. Let's say reaches her couch that she's sitting on, or bed, but in Talmudic times they would lay on beds like a couch. Now, and it was 10 tefachim high, then there is a migration, then she's divorced, and the reason for that is, why specifically 10 tefachim high? Because something that's 10 tefachim high is considered a separate domain, as the Rambam says in the Kriya Shema. So here it's not anymore in the husband's domain, and moreover, the husband not particular about, but the legs of the bed are in his property, that he's not particular about regarding the legs. And the bed itself is above 10 tefachim, not in his domain, so then it's going to work even in his property. Halacha tes. Let's say let's say he lends her space in his courtyard, so that now it's considered her own area, but he didn't designate exactly demarcating which area in his courtyard that is going to be hers, so that she could receive her get. Now, Bazark get, so he throws her the get, Vigila arba amash and it reaches within the dalat amas that she's standing in, then there is a magesh, then she can be divorced. But if it went actually out of her dalat amas, she's not going to be divorced, because even in her own courtyard, she's not divorced until she's standing on the side. For sure, an area which is just lent to her in his courtyard, that she's not divorced until she's standing near it. Now, let's say in this galgal, let's say after it landed for a moment within her dalat amas, it then rolled away. And it lands on a beam, or on a rock, which is at a distance from her. So, if the place where it fell on, wasn't an area of 4 amas square, and second of all, so it's not 10 tefachim high, and third of all, it does not have a separate secondary name to it as like a distinct area. So it doesn't have any one of these three criteria, so it doesn't cut off like as if it's its own area. And it's as if the get and the woman are in the same place. Oh, then she's going to be divorced. But if it has one of these three things, where it's 10 tefachim high, or it has another name to it, this area, or it's 4 amas squared, then it's designating its own separate area, and therefore it's not secondary to the rest of the courtyard. And he only lent her one place in this courtyard. He didn't lend her 2 places, so she's not going to be divorced, because this is considered a separate area, until the get actually then subsequently reaches her hand. Now, halacha yud, the Rambam continues regarding throwing the get near the domain of the woman. Let's say he throws the get to her domain, but it passes through her domain, but which she's standing in, but actually lands, it goes through and lands out of her domain. So even if it was going through her property within 3 tefachim from the ground, which we say generally love it as if it touched the ground, in immigration, not divorced, until it actually lands in her domain, as we had said previously, that this is avash inside for Lenuach. It's airspace which is not ultimately going to land, as we see it didn't, it actually went through, so it's not like it landed, and even though it was within 3 tefachim, it should not be divorced until it actually lands in her domain. Let's say she was standing on her roof and he threw it to her. But actually ended up landing. He was off, doesn't have a great shot, and landed on another roof right near it. If she could stretch out her hand and take it from that other roof, then she actually is divorced. And the reason is, although they're separate tenants on the upper roof, just like there's different tenants in the building beneath, so you would say that, as we find regarding the laws of Shabbos, that these are like two different properties, and therefore maybe she has no rights over here. But still, people are generally not particular about things like this because she's not even going on that person's property. She's standing on her own roof. She's just stretching out and getting from the other roof. So that person wouldn't be particular, and therefore that would be considered as it went to her and she'd be divorced. Halacha Yud Beis. Let's say her hand was on an incline, which her fingertips were facing towards the ground. V'zarka get al yodav navel arts, and he threw the get on her hand, and it fell from the ground from her hand. So if it fell within her dalad amas, v'nach, and it landed on the ground. Now we're talking about in the property it's not hers because it was her own property. Of course she would be divorced because even if it doesn't come into her hands, even if it's out of her dalad amas, she'd be divorced. So it's not her property, but it falls within dalad amas of her reason magreshes, then she's divorced because a person's dalad amas acquires for them in some other area, let's say that an area has no owners, that would be valid for her. Now, let's say it falls into the sea or into the fire. In immigration, she's not divorced because that's something that's inaccessible. But this is only problematic if she had initially been standing there over the water or near the fire, where in the beginning its fall was inevitable that it was going to be over there, as we had previously said. Where in contrast, if it only came later, then we say that already in the Avra was already considered hers. But here, she never actually got it. And although it's within Dal Ramet, but it landed in the fire or in the water and they got erased or whatever, got ruined beforehand. So therefore, the ear space was Abashain Sevel, and therefore it's going to be considered as if it never landed in our area, and it's not going to be valid as a get. Now, Halacha Yud Gimel, the Rambam continues regarding throwing a get in a domain that is not owned by either one of them. Let's say he throws it to her in the street, in the public domain, or an area that's not owned by either one of them. Now, if it's karv, if it's closer to him, which Rambam is going to explain in the next halacha what that means, in immigration is not divorced. Now, how you get let's say it's 50-50, it's close to him and to her. So, until it's going to be closer to her, definitively, she's only in doubt if she's divorced. Now, but let's say even how you karv, let's say it was even close to her, that she could bend down and she could take it, still her is a get puzzle. It's going to be rabbinically, that's the Rambam always says the word puzzle means rabbinically, which means to say that if she gets married, we don't remove her from her next marriage. But the reason why we say rabbinically, it's invalid because people might confuse and say that what's far is close, but really it's far, and therefore it's not really a valid get. So rabbinically it's invalid, even though it really is close to her. Until the get actually reaches her hand, and even initially she should go ahead and get married to someone else. Now, Allah Yadad Rambam clarifies, says, what's considered close to him? So it's like this. If he could protect it, she cannot protect it, it's considered close to him, even if it's not close to him technically, even if it's 100 amas away. Let's say both of them could equally protect it. Or both of them cannot protect it. So that's considered 50-50, and again, that's going to be something Megresh is doubtful if she's divorced or not. Now, let's say Bahu Tchila, let's say he comes first to the Rosh Hashanah or to the meeting place, which is not owned by either one that they had made up to come. He comes first, so and he stands over there. Then she stands opposite him, like they're getting ready for this transfer of the get over here. They're finally meeting, they hadn't met, and who knows what. And he throws it to her. So, if the get, when he threw it to her and it lands on the floor, it was within his dalad amas, in immigration, she's not divorced. Even if she would bend down and she could take it, and you would think, okay, so that's considered in her dalad amas. But since his dalad amas acquires for him, and it's within his dalad amas, so he already acquired it because he was here first. His dalad amas, he has the first right. So it's like as if it never left from him. But let's say she stood there first. Then he came later and he stood opposite her. And throws it to her. Here the chiddush is the other way, even if it's 50-50, meaning both of them can protect it, with the hard dalamas, and she came first. Harezi get puzzle, so it's only going to be rabbinically invalidated, like we said, because of the gezeru. We say rabbinically it's not okay, but biblically it is okay because hard dalamas is first. But again, it's going to be rabbinically a problem until the get actually reaches her hand. Now, Halakha Design, the Rambam talks about throwing a get to her, but it's still attached to him. Zarka get liyada. Let's say he throws the get to her hand. But it was tied with a thread. And some of the thread is in his hand. So it depends. It's like if he could pull it, pull back the get and bring it to him with the thread, then she's not divorced. Because the Torah says, Krisis means to say that they're separated. And here they're not separated because they're still attached with the thread. Until the thread is cut off. Now, let's say it's still connected with the thread, but he can't actually pull it out of her hand because let's say the get was heavy and the thread was very thin. If he'd pull it, the thread would become detached. Then the reason then she's still divorced even if the thread is attached. Now, Halach Yud Zayin, the Rambam continues regarding, let's say, giving the get into her evet. Halach Yud Zayin. Let's not get biyat avda. Let's say he gives the get into the hand of her slave. Now, who neir, and the slave is awake, but v'hima shamartei, she's safeguarding her slave. So im hayakafis, if the slave was bound, he was tied up, hariz get and zavald get, uki'ilahi higila chatzera, and it says her slave is her property. It's like her chatzer, as if it reached her courtyard. She amedis b'tzid, where she's standing there on the side, which is mishtameres, like we said, that's going to work. But if the slave is not bound, then ain't a get, then it's not going to be a valid get. The reason for that is because we said that it has to be a chatzah mishtameres, it has to be protected, like a person's hand is, l'daita, like a person's hand is, but here it's shaloi l'daita, because the slave protects himself and whatever's inside his hand. Moreover, since he's not bound, he's what's called a chatzah maleches. He's a movable courtyard, which does not acquire for the owner, because the Torah only includes her courtyard, her roof, her enclosed area, which don't move by itself, and not things that move. Now, however, the Torah and the Meiri actually, they bring the Lashon Rambam, not like we have it over here. They bring that if he puts the get into the hand of her slave and he's awake and she's protecting him, then even if he was bound, it wouldn't be a get. According to that, meaning what it needs to be is not only bound, but he also has to be sleeping. So that sleeping, that he's protected with her das, because he's not awake to protect himself, and also bound so that he shouldn't be chatzah malachas. Now, but there is a difference between those two different problems. If he's awake, it's biblically a problem, even if he's bound, because since he's awake, he's mishtameres l'daito, not l'dato. Now, if he's sleeping over it and he's not bound, then he's protected l'daita, but it's only rabbinically a problem because he's not moving. The only problem would be because of if he would be awake, then there'd be a problem. So therefore, that would be a difference between those two different amounts. But according to that Girsa, the Ram requires both tied and sleeping. Now, the son be able to have it, but let's say he puts in the hand of the slave and he's sleeping, and therefore as she's protecting him. So again, here Hariz apostle is rabbinically invalid. Again, according to biblical law, it is okay because he's being protected with her das because he's sleeping. But they made a gzir rabbanan not to allow sleeping because of when he's awake, which then it would be a problem. Now, the reason why I make a gzir over there because sleeping and awake is very common. But they were not geyser when he's bound because of not being bound, because being bound is not common, and whatever it's called davar she'eino matzei, the rabbanan were not geyser by. Now, but then hayukafas, but it was bound. Then she's going to be divorced, which that works very well according to the gears to other Torah. Because according to our gears, so this is extra because if we said that if he's bound and sleeping, it's a get, for sure, if he's bound and, we say if he's bound and awake, it's going to work, for sure if he's bound and sleeping, where we're talking about here, we're sleeping, and then if he's bound, it's migreshes, of course. So that works well with the Torah, who makes it sound like that, no, it has to be bound and sleeping too. Halach Yud Ches. Kasav a get in the son miyad abdi. Let's say he writes a get and he puts it in the hand of his slave. Not her slave, his slave. Because of but then he writes a document of gift to her on his slave. Oh, so once she acquires, she merits the slave. Get in discussion, then she merits the get that is in his hand, because now it's her slave, and she's divorced because the slave now becomes like her courtyard. And what's called gita v'chatzei bon echad, her get with her courtyard is coming at the same time. It's like he's giving her not only the eved, but also the get with it. But this is imhoyer kafis, only if the slave was bound. Because if he's not bound, then you have the problem of that he's chatzah maleches. Now, however, according to the gears of the Torah and the Meiri, you have to be not only bound, but also sleeping. Because if it's awake, that gears holds that it's not going to work. Now, but the main covers of an air, but if he's not bound and he's awake, then comes the eved, So she acquires the slave because that he's gifting her. But in immigration, not divorced, until it actually reaches her hand again, because the Ev is not going to work, because it's a problem of chatzam aleches, and it's a problem because he's being mishtameris l'daita, not l'daita. Now, so too, if he puts the get in his courtyard, same as the slave, as his slave in his courtyard, and he sells her the courtyard, in the son-in-law, he gives it to her, once she acquires the courtyard, either with a document, of a castle with money, of a chazaka, or taking possession of it, which, as the Rambam explains how that's actually done, then the skarsha, then again, she's going to be divorced because she acquires it. Here, the promise is the eved regarding being bound or awake. A chatzar is always not movable and is always mishtameres l'daita. Then once she acquires that, she automatically gets divorced with the get that's inside the chatzar.